Pygmalion Effect. A teacher is told certain students in her class are gifted. They're not. The names were picked at random, but she doesn't know that. She believes it. And because she believes it, everything changes. She teaches them differently, calls on them more, waits longer for their answers, expects more, gives more. By the end of the year, those students are at the top of the class. Not because they were special, because she thought they were. This is the Pygmalion Effect. When you expect someone to succeed, you create the conditions for them to succeed. It's not magic. It's a self-fulfilling cycle that rewrites potential through belief alone. The mechanism is simple. When someone expects you to succeed, they treat you like someone who will. More opportunities, more patience, more investment, and you absorb it. You start seeing yourself the way they see you. You try harder, take risks. You become capable because you believe you are. It shows up everywhere. A manager sees leadership potential in a junior employee. Bigger projects, strategy meetings, introductions to executives. The employee rises to meet it. Within a year promoted. The belief created the reality. A parent tells their child they're good at math. The child stops seeing math as a threat. They push through problems instead of giving up. They ask more questions. Performance improves. Not because of talent. Because of confidence that came from someone else's expectation. Even in relationships, if you believe your partner is thoughtful, you interpret their actions through that lens. A delayed text becomes, they're busy, not they're ignoring me. That trust gives them room to be thoughtful. The expectation shapes the reality. The Pygmalion Effect doesn't just change what you do, it changes who you are. The expectations become internalized. You carry them even when no one's watching. You don't just perform better, you become better. But if belief can build, it can also destroy. Golem Effect. Low expectations don't just lower performance, they kill it. A manager inherits a team member with a bad reputation. Slow, unreliable, so she gives them the easy tasks. The ones that don't matter, minimal check-ins, no real feedback. When mistakes happen, she's not surprised, she expected it. The employee notices. Of course they do. They're not invited to important meetings. They're not given meaningful work. The message is loud, you're not capable. And over time, they stop trying to prove otherwise. Why bother? The verdict's already in. Performance drops. The manager's belief confirmed. The prophecy fulfilled itself. This is the Golem Effect. Where belief builds, disbelief destroys. Same mechanism, reverse direction. Expect failure, create failure. It works through withdrawal. When you expect someone to underperform, you pull back without realizing it. Less responsibility, less guidance, less explanation. You don't waste time on the bigger picture because you assume they won't get it anyway. And without those opportunities, they can't grow. They're trapped in the box your expectations built. In schools, it's devastating. A teacher decides a student isn't a math person. She moves on quickly during lessons, doesn't call on them, groups them with other struggling students. The student picks up on it, stops raising their hand, stops asking questions, convinces themselves the teacher's right, grades drop. The label sticks. At work, it's just as brutal. Certain people are marked as B players, never considered for high visibility projects, kept in the same roles year after year. Without bigger challenges, they never develop new skills. Careers stagnate. And the person who labeled them points to that stagnation as proof they were right all along. Even in families, a parent constantly compares one child unfavorably to a sibling. And why can't you be more like your brother? The child hears it enough times and stops competing. They accept the role, the disappointment, the one who doesn't measure up. That identity hardens. Years later, they still carry it. The cruelty of the Golem Effect is that it doesn't announce itself. No one says, I have low expectations for you. They just act on it. And the person on the receiving end decodes the pattern from what they're denied, what's assumed about them before they try. Low expectations don't feel like pressure. They feel like indifference. And indifference is permission to stop caring. When no one expects anything from you, you stop expecting anything from yourself. Halo Effect. Someone walks into a job interview well-dressed, confident, articulate. Within minutes, the interviewer has made a decision. This person is competent, organized, trustworthy. None of that has been tested. but the assumption is already locked in. The rest of the interview becomes a formality. Every answer gets interpreted through that initial impression. A vague response becomes strategic thinking. A lack of specific examples becomes big-picture vision. The person could be completely unqualified, but the first impression has already written the story. This is the halo effect. One positive trait creates a glow that spreads to everything else. You're not evaluating the person anymore. You're confirming what you already decided about them. It works because the brain hates uncertainty. When you meet someone, you don't have enough information to judge them fully. So your mind takes a shortcut. It grabs onto one noticeable trait and uses it to fill in the rest. Attractive, probably intelligent. Well-spoken, probably competent. Friendly, probably honest. The logic doesn't hold, but it feels right. And once that halo is in place, it's almost impossible to remove. Contradictory evidence gets ignored or reinterpreted. A mistake becomes a rare slip. A failure becomes bad luck. The halo protects the image you've already built. In workplaces, it shows up constantly. A colleague who speaks confidently in meetings gets credit for being insightful, even when their ideas are mediocre. Someone who dresses well gets assumed to be more professional, even if their work is sloppy. The trait that stands out becomes the lens through which everything else is judged. In relationships, it's just as powerful. You meet someone charming and assume they're also kind. You meet someone successful and assume they're also driven. The initial attraction creates a story, and you interpret everything they do to fit that story. You ignore the warning signs because the halo is too bright. Teachers do it with students. A student who's polite and well-behaved gets the benefit of the doubt on assignments. A student who participates actively gets assumed to understand the material, even when they don't. The halo makes you see what you expect to see, not what's actually there. The halo effect doesn't require malice. It's automatic. But it shapes decisions, careers, and relationships based on impressions that were never accurate to begin with. Horn effect. A candidate shows up to an interview 5 minutes late. Traffic, construction, doesn't matter. The interviewer's judgment shifts. Unreliable, disorganized. Careless, the interview hasn't even started, but the conclusion is already forming. Every answer after that gets filtered through that first impression. A thoughtful response becomes overcomplicated. Confidence becomes arrogance. Experience becomes irrelevant because the negative frame is set. One bad moment and everything else gets dragged down with it. This is the horn effect, the dark twin of the halo. One negative trait doesn't just stand alone. It spreads. It colors every other judgment you make. And once it's there, it's nearly impossible to shake. The mechanism is identical to the halo effect, just reversed. Your brain latches onto something negative and uses it to construct the rest of the story. Someone stutters during a presentation, unprepared. Someone dresses casually, unprofessional. The trait becomes the narrative, and everything else bends to fit it. At work, it's ruthless. An employee makes one visible mistake, and suddenly their competence is questioned across the board. They miss a deadline once, and every project after that gets scrutinized. Colleagues start noticing other flaws that were always there but never mattered before. The horn magnifies everything. In schools, a student talks back once, and teachers start seeing them as a troublemaker. Grades get harsher, behavior gets monitored more closely. Other students pick up on it and distance themselves. The label sticks, and the student's reputation becomes a self-fulfilling loop. Even in relationships, the horn effect quietly destroys trust. Your partner forgets an important date, and suddenly you start questioning whether they care at all. One argument where they say something harsh, and you begin reinterpreting past conversations. Were they always this selfish? The horn rewrites history. What makes it so damaging is that it's not based on patterns. It's based on moments. A single impression that gets inflated into a permanent judgment. And unlike the halo effect, which at least offers unearned benefits, the horn effect offers nothing but unearned punishment. The person on the receiving end can feel it. They sense the shift. They try harder, explain more, apologize repeatedly. But once the horn is in place, effort gets read as desperation. Apologies get read as proof of guilt. There's no way out because the lens has already been set. The horn effect doesn't need evidence. It just needs one bad moment. and from there it builds a case that was never real. Bystander Effect. Someone collapses on a crowded sidewalk. Dozens of people walk past. A few glance. Most keep moving. No one stops. Not because they don't care, because everyone assumes someone else will handle it. The more people present, the less likely any individual will act. It's not apathy. It's a psychological diffusion of responsibility that grows stronger as the crowd gets larger. And in that moment, the person who needed help is left alone in a sea of witnesses. This is the Bystander Effect. The presence of others doesn't increase the chance of help. It kills it. The mechanism is rooted in how we process responsibility. When you're alone and you see someone in trouble, the responsibility is clear. It's on you. But when others are around, that responsibility fractures. You look at the crowd and assume someone more qualified will step in. A doctor, a paramedic, someone who knows what to do. And while you're assuming that, everyone else is making the same assumption. There's another layer, social uncertainty. No one wants to overact. You see someone on the ground and you're not sure if it's an emergency or if they're just resting. You look around to see how others are responding. If no one else is alarmed, you convince yourself it's fine. The crowd's inaction becomes permission for your own. It happens in emergencies, but it also happens in everyday moments. Someone's being harassed on a train. Everyone hears it. No one intervenes. A colleague is being treated unfairly in a meeting. Everyone notices. No one speaks up. The presence of others doesn't make action more likely. It makes it easier to stay silent. Even online, the Bystander Effect operates at scale. Thousands see a harmful post. Most scroll past. A few feel uncomfortable. Almost no one reports it. The assumption is always the same: someone else will handle it. And often no one does. What makes the Bystander Effect so insidious is that it doesn't require bad people. It just requires normal people in a group. People who, if they were alone, would probably help. But in a crowd, responsibility dissolves. Action feels risky. Inaction feels safe. And the person who needed help is left wondering why no one cared. But it's not that no one cared. It's that everyone assumed someone else would. Mere exposure effect. You hear a song on the radio. The first time, it's unremarkable, maybe even irritating. You change the station. But it's everywhere. Coffee shops, grocery stores, your colleagues' playlist. After a week, you're not changing the station anymore. After 2 weeks, you're humming it. You didn't decide to like it. You just got used to it. This is the mere exposure effect. Familiarity doesn't breed contempt. It breeds preference. The more you're exposed to something, the more you tend to like it. No reason required, just repetition. The mechanism is simple. The brain treats familiarity as safety. The first time you encounter something new, your mind is on alert. Unfamiliar means unpredictable. Unpredictable means potential threat. But after repeated exposure with no negative outcome, the brain relaxes. Familiarity becomes comfort. Comfort becomes preference. It's why brands spend millions on repetition. You see the same logo, the same jingle, the same tagline over and over. You're not consciously deciding you like it. But when you're standing in a store choosing between two similar products, you reach for the one that feels familiar. The one you've seen 100 times. The exposure did its work. It shows up in relationships too. You meet someone at work, first impression fine, nothing special. But you see them every day. Coffee, breaks, meetings, casual conversations. Over time, you start to like them more, not because they changed, because repeated exposure made them feel safe, predictable, comfortable. Even in politics, the mere exposure effect shapes opinions. A candidate's face on every billboard, every ad, every news segment. The policies barely matter. What matters is that the face becomes familiar, and familiar feels trustworthy. Voters choose the candidate they've seen the most, not necessarily the one with the best platform. The effect is so powerful it works even when you're not paying attention. Subliminal exposure still counts. A brand flashing on screen for a fraction of a second. A name mentioned in passing. Your conscious mind doesn't register it, but your brain is keeping score. And that score influences your preferences later. What makes the mere exposure effect unsettling is that it operates beneath awareness. You think you're making choices based on quality, on merit, on personal taste. But often you're just choosing what's most familiar, the thing you've been exposed to the most, Repetition became preference, and you never noticed the shift. Spotlight Effect. You spill coffee on your shirt before a meeting. Everyone's going to notice. They'll remember it, they'll talk about it later. You spend the entire meeting hyper-aware of the stain, convinced every glance is a judgment. But when the meeting ends, no one mentions it, because no one saw it. Or if they did, they forgot within seconds. You were convinced you were the center of attention. You weren't. We overestimate how much others notice us. It's called the spotlight effect. You feel like you're constantly being watched, evaluated, remembered. But the truth is, most people are too busy worrying about themselves to pay attention to you. The reason is simple. You're the main character in your own life. Every mistake, every awkward moment, every visible flaw feels magnified because you're experiencing it from the inside. But to everyone else, your background, a passing detail. They have their own spotlight, and it's pointed at themselves. A student gives a presentation and stumbles over a word. To them, it's a disaster. They replay it in their head for days, but when they ask classmates later, most don't even remember the stumble. They were too focused on their own upcoming presentations to notice. Someone wears a new outfit and feels self-conscious the entire day. They're sure everyone's staring, but most people glance once, if at all, and move on. The attention you think you're getting doesn't exist. You're not being watched as closely as you believe. Even embarrassing moments follow the same pattern. You trip in public and feel like the whole street saw it. Maybe a few people noticed, but within an hour they've forgotten. You're the only one still replaying it. The spotlight effect doesn't just make you self-conscious. It holds you back. You avoid speaking up because you think everyone will judge you. You don't take risks because you're convinced all eyes are on you. But they're not. You're not the main character in anyone's story but your own. Zeigarnik Effect. Why can't you stop thinking about the email you didn't send? The project you started but haven't finished? The conversation you left unresolved? It's not that they're urgent. It's that they're incomplete. And your brain refuses to let go. Unfinished tasks take up more mental space than finished ones. They loop in the background. They interrupt your focus. They surface at random moments, demanding attention. Completed tasks disappear, incomplete tasks haunt you. This is the Zeigarnik Effect, named after a psychologist who noticed waiters could remember complex orders perfectly until the moment they were delivered. Once the task was done, the memory vanished. The brain holds onto what's unfinished and releases what's complete. It works because your mind treats incomplete tasks as open loops. As long as something is unresolved, your brain keeps it active, ready to return to. It's a survival mechanism. Unfinished business could be a threat, a half-built shelter, an unresolved conflict, something that needs attention, so your brain keeps reminding you, over and over. That's why cliffhangers work. A TV show ends mid-scene, and you can't stop thinking about what happens next. The story is unfinished, so your brain refuses to let it go. Streaming services know this. They count on it. One more episode. One more loop that hasn't closed. At work, it shows up constantly. You leave a task half done and spend the rest of the day distracted by it. Not because it's important, because it's incomplete. The moment you finish it, the mental weight lifts. The loop closes. Your brain stops nagging. Even in conversations, the effect operates. An argument ends without resolution, and you replay it for hours. You think of better responses. You imagine what you should have said. The conversation is unfinished, so your mind won't release it. But the moment you resolve it, even poorly, the replaying stops. The Zeigarnik Effect is why to-do lists work. Writing down a task tricks your brain into thinking the loop is closed. You've acknowledged it. You've captured it. Your mind can stop holding it in active memory. The relief is immediate. Not because you've done the task, because you've contained it. But the effect cuts both ways. It keeps you focused on what matters, and it traps you in loops that don't. Pratfall Effect. A speaker walks on stage, trips slightly, laughs it off, and starts the talk. The audience doesn't lose respect. If anything, they lean in more. The stumble didn't hurt. It helped. It made the speaker human. Competence is attractive, but competence plus a small, recoverable flaw is more attractive. A minor mistake doesn't destroy your image. It softens it. It makes you relatable instead of distant, likable instead of intimidating. This is the Pratfall Effect. Perfection can feel cold. A small imperfection warms it up, not a major failure, not incompetence. Just a visible slip that reminds people you're real. The key is that it only works if you're already seen as competent. A job candidate with a strong resume who spills water during the interview becomes endearing. A candidate with a weak resume who spills water just looks careless. The pratfall enhances an existing positive impression. It doesn't create one. In relationships, people who never admit mistakes or show vulnerability often come across as unapproachable. But someone confident enough to laugh at themselves, to acknowledge when they're wrong, feels safer to be around. The small admissions of imperfection don't weaken them, they build trust. Even in marketing, brands use the Pratfall Effect intentionally. A company known for quality releases an ad that pokes fun at a minor flaw in their product. It doesn't hurt sales. It humanizes the brand. Customers trust them more because they're willing to acknowledge imperfection. But the effect has limits. The mistake has to be small, recoverable. If the flaw is too large, it stops being endearing and starts being disqualifying. A minor stumble works. A catastrophic failure doesn't. And the recovery matters. If you make a mistake and get defensive, the effect reverses. But if you acknowledge it lightly and move on, people respect the composure. The pratfall becomes proof of confidence, not weakness. Perfection makes people keep their distance. A small, well-handled imperfection brings them closer. Barnum Effect. You read your horoscope. You have a great need for other people to like you. At times you are extroverted and sociable, while at other times you are introverted and reserved. It feels personal, specific, like it was written just for you. It wasn't. It was written for everyone. And that's exactly why it works. When a statement is vague enough to apply to almost anyone, people interpret it as deeply personal. They fill in the gaps with their own experiences and convince themselves it's accurate. The description didn't reveal anything. You revealed it to yourself. This is the Barnum Effect. General statements feel specific when you want them to. Your mind does the work of making them fit. And once they fit, you believe they're true. It shows up everywhere. Personality tests with broad results. You're creative but practical. You value honesty but understand when flexibility is needed. These aren't insights, they're mirrors. Vague enough that almost anyone can see themselves reflected back. Fortune tellers rely on it. They make sweeping statements that sound personal. You've experienced a loss that still affects you. You have untapped potential you haven't fully explored. Most people have experienced loss. Most people feel they have untapped potential. The statement isn't specific, it just feels that way. Even in feedback, the Barnum Effect operates. A manager tells an employee, "You're detail-oriented but sometimes get caught up in perfectionism." The employee nods. It feels accurate. But the same statement could apply to most people who care about their work. The feedback didn't identify anything unique. It just matched a general pattern the employee recognized in themselves. What makes the Barnum Effect so powerful is that it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like understanding. You're not being tricked. You're being seen. Except you're not. You're seeing yourself in something designed to reflect everyone. And once you believe the general statement is specific to you, you start trusting the source. If they got this right, maybe they're insightful about other things too. The effect doesn't just create false accuracy. It builds false credibility. Quo Effect. A psychology professor hands out personality assessments to his students. A week later, he returns the results. Each student reads their profile, stunned by how accurate it is. They rate it highly. Personal, insightful, deeply true. Then the professor asks them to compare. Every student received the exact same profile, word for word. The accuracy was an illusion. The personalization was a lie. But every student believed it was written specifically for them. This is the Quo Effect. When feedback is presented as personalized, people accept vague statements as specific truths. The brain doesn't question whether the description actually fits. It assumes it does because it was delivered as if it were tailored. The mechanism is rooted in confirmation bias. You read a statement about yourself and immediately search your memory for examples that support it. You tend to be critical of yourself. Your mind pulls up every moment of self-doubt you've ever had. The statement feels accurate because you're actively building the case for it. It's why online quizzes feel so revealing. Based on your answers, you're an introspective thinker who values deep connections but sometimes struggles with overthinking. Millions of people get some version of that result, but each one believes it's uniquely theirs. The quiz didn't analyze anything. It just mirrored back language broad enough to fit almost anyone. Astrology runs on the Four Effect. A birth chart reading feels specific because it's presented as calculated from your exact birth time and location. But the interpretations are templates, vague enough to apply widely, specific enough to feel personal. You do the rest. You make it fit. Even professional settings aren't immune. Corporate personality assessments return results that feel customized. You're a natural collaborator who thrives in team environments but values independent work. That describes most functional employees. But because it was generated from a questionnaire you filled out, it feels like it uncovered something real about you. The Four Effect doesn't require deception to work. It just requires the appearance of personalization. Once you believe something was made for you, you'll find a way to make it true. Dunning-Kruger Effect. Someone takes a beginner photography class. 2 weeks in, they're giving advice to professionals online, critiquing composition, explaining exposure, confident they've figured it out. Meanwhile, the professionals stay quiet. They know how much they don't know. The less you know about something, the more confident you can be, because you don't know enough to realize what you're missing. Competence brings doubt. Incompetence brings certainty. At the bottom of the learning curve, confidence peaks. You've learned just enough to think you understand the whole picture, but you haven't learned enough to see how vast the picture actually is. So you speak with authority you haven't earned. You don't know what you don't know. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Ignorance inflates confidence. Expertise deflates it. Not because experts lack confidence in their abilities, but because they've seen enough to know how complex the field is. How much remains uncertain? How many edge cases exist? It shows up everywhere. A new employee joins a company and immediately suggests sweeping changes. They've been there 2 weeks. They don't understand the systems, the history, the reasons things are the way they are. But they're confident they have the answers. The people who've been there for years are more hesitant. They've seen what doesn't work. They know the constraints. In online spaces, the effect is constant. The loudest voices are often the least informed. The people who've spent years studying a topic tend to hedge. They qualify. They acknowledge nuance. The people who read one article speak in absolutes. They're certain because they don't know enough to doubt. Even in skills, the pattern holds. A beginner learns a few techniques and thinks they've mastered the craft. An expert knows how much they still have to learn. The beginner's confidence comes from limited exposure. The expert's humility comes from deep exposure. The gap between confidence and competence can be dangerous. It's why bad advice spreads so easily. The person giving it doesn't realize it's bad. They genuinely believe they're helping, and their confidence makes them convincing. People trust certainty, even when it's unearned. But there's a second curve. As you keep learning, competence eventually catches up to confidence. You start to understand what you actually know. Your certainty becomes grounded. But getting there requires pushing through the stage where you realize how little you knew when you thought you knew everything. The Dunning-Kruger effect isn't about stupidity. It's about the relationship between knowledge and self-awareness, and how, at the beginning, you don't have enough of either to know the difference. IKEA Effect. You spend an afternoon assembling a bookshelf. The instructions are confusing. The pieces don't fit smoothly. You have leftover screws you're not sure what to do with. But when it's done, you love it. You think it looks better than anything in the store. You're convinced it's worth more than you paid. It's not. It's the same mass-produced furniture everyone else has. But because you built it, you value it more. The effort you put in didn't make it better. It made you see it as better. Labor creates attachment. When you build something, even poorly, you overvalue it. The work convinces you the result is more valuable than it actually is. That's the IKEA effect. Effort becomes worth. Involvement becomes quality. The mechanism is rooted in how we justify our time. If you spent hours on something, your brain needs to believe it was worth it. Otherwise, the time feels wasted. So you inflate the value. You convince yourself the outcome justifies the effort. Even when it doesn't. It shows up in work constantly. A team spends months developing a strategy. By the time they're done, they're attached to it. Not because it's the best option, because they built it. They defend it against better alternatives. The effort clouds the judgment. Even in cooking, a meal you spent hours preparing tastes better to you than the same meal from a restaurant. Not because it's objectively better, because you made it. The time you invested becomes part of the perceived value. Parents see it with their children's art. A drawing that's objectively simple becomes priceless because their child made it. The attachment isn't to the quality, it's to the involvement. The effort you witnessed or contributed to inflates the perceived worth. The IKEA effect doesn't just make you overvalue things, it makes you blind to flaws. You ignore the crooked shelf because you don't want to admit the time was wasted. You defend the mediocre result because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging the effort didn't pay off. The more you build, the less clearly you see. Framing effect. A doctor tells a patient about a surgery. This procedure has a 90% survival rate. The patient feels reassured, confident. They agree to the surgery. Another doctor describes the exact same procedure to another patient. This procedure has a 10% mortality rate. The patient hesitates, asks for alternatives, reconsiders. Same surgery, same statistics, different frame, different decision. How information is presented changes how you perceive it, not the facts, just the angle. Survival sounds safe, mortality sounds dangerous. Your brain doesn't process them as identical. It processes them as different risks. Framing doesn't alter reality, it alters perception. And perception drives decisions. A discount framed as save 20% feels better than pay 80%, even though the math is the same. Your brain responds to the frame, not the number. Marketing relies on it. Ninety 5% fat-free sells better than 5% fat. Same product. Same amount of fat, different emotional response. The positive frame makes it feel healthier. The negative frame makes it feel risky. Neither is more accurate. One just feels better. Even in negotiations, framing shifts outcomes. You'll lose this opportunity if you don't act now. Creates urgency through fear. You'll gain exclusive access if you act now. Creates urgency through reward. Same deadline, same offer, different emotional trigger. At work, how feedback is framed changes how it's received. You completed 80% of your tasks on time. Sounds competent. You missed 20% of your deadliness. Sounds careless, same performance. Different implications. The employee's response shifts based on which frame they hear. Politically, framing defines debates. Pro-choice and pro-life describe opposing positions on the same issue, but each frame emphasizes different values. Choice versus life. The frame doesn't just describe the stance, it shapes how people emotionally respond to it. The framing effect doesn't manipulate facts, it manipulates emphasis, and emphasis is enough to change minds. Anchoring effect. A car salesman shows you a vehicle. This one's $45,000. You wince, too expensive. He pauses, then shows you another. This one's $30,000. Suddenly it feels reasonable. Affordable. Even. You don't realize that $30,000 was the price you should have been comparing to market value. You're comparing it to 45. The first number anchored you. Everything after that is relative to it. The first piece of information you receive becomes the reference point for everything that follows. Even when it's irrelevant. Even when it's random. Your brain latches onto it and judges all subsequent information against it. Anchoring works because your mind craves context. When you don't have a baseline, the first number you see becomes one. It doesn't matter if it's accurate, it matters that it's first. And once it's set, it's hard to shake. In negotiations, whoever offers the first number sets the anchor. If you're selling something and you say a price first, the other person's counteroffer will orbit around that number. If they say a price first, your response will too. The anchor pulls everything toward it. Even in everyday decisions, anchoring shapes choices. A restaurant lists a $100 steak on the menu. Most people won't order it. But it makes the $50 steak feel more reasonable. The expensive item isn't there to sell. It's there to anchor expectations, to make everything else look like a better deal. Retailers use it constantly. Originally $120, now $60. You think you're getting a deal. But was it ever really worth $120? Maybe, maybe not. The anchor is doing its job either way. You're not evaluating the actual value. You're reacting to the gap between the two numbers. Even in performance reviews, anchoring operates. A manager mentions a colleague's raise first. Sarah got a 3% increase. When you hear you're getting 4%, it feels generous. But if they'd started with most people are getting 6%, your 4% would feel like a slight. The anchor determines whether you feel rewarded or shortchanged. The first number doesn't have to be fair, it just has to be first. After that, everything else adjusts around it. Contrast effect. You try on a jacket, it looks fine. Then the salesperson brings out another one. Slightly better cut, slightly nicer fabric. Suddenly the first jacket looks worse. It hasn't changed. You're just seeing it next to something better. The comparison shifted your perception. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything you evaluate is measured against something else, and the thing you measure it against changes how you see it. That's the contrast effect. Context rewrites value. It works because your brain doesn't have absolute scales. It has relative ones. A medium coffee feels small next to a large. The same coffee feels large next to a small. The liquid didn't change, the reference did, and the reference determines the judgment. In hiring, the contrast effect shapes decisions constantly. A decent candidate interviews after a weak one. They seem brilliant. The same candidate interviews after a strong one. They seem mediocre. Their skills didn't change between interviews. The comparison did, and the comparison becomes the evaluation. Even in relationships, the effect operates quietly. You meet someone right after a bad breakup. They seem amazing by comparison. Not because they're perfect, because the contrast makes their flaws invisible. The previous relationship becomes the anchor. Anything better feels exceptional. Retailers exploit it deliberately. They show you an expensive item first, then a cheaper one. The cheaper one feels like a bargain, even if it's still overpriced. The contrast makes the price feel reasonable. You're not judging the item on its own merit. You're judging it against what you just saw. Teachers experience it when grading. Read a strong essay, then a mediocre one. The mediocre one seems worse than it is. Read a weak essay, then a mediocre one. The mediocre one seems better. The student's work didn't change. The order did. And the order affected the grade. The contrast effect doesn't ask whether something is good. It asks whether something is better or worse than what came before. And that comparison becomes the verdict. Primacy Effect. A candidate walks into an interview. The first question they fumble, nervous, unclear. The rest of the interview goes smoothly, but the interviewer keeps returning to that first stumble in their mind. Competent answers don't erase it. The first impression already set the tone. Everything after that fights uphill. First impressions carry disproportionate weight. They set the frame. They anchor expectations. And they're hard to overwrite. What comes first matters more than what comes after, even when what comes after is better. Memory is biased toward beginnings. When you try to recall a list, the first few items come back easily. The middle blurs. The end sharpens again, but the beginning dominates. Your brain prioritizes what it encountered first. In meetings, the primacy effect shapes decisions. The first person to speak often sets the direction of the conversation. Their argument becomes the baseline. Everyone else is either agreeing with it or arguing against it. The initial framing becomes the debate. Even if better ideas emerge later, they're positioned as alternatives to the first one. The first one already claimed the center. Lawyers know this. Opening statements matter more than closing ones. Jurors form impressions early. Those impressions are hard to shift. Evidence presented later has to fight against the frame the opening established. If the opening was strong, the rest of the case reinforces it. If the opening was weak, the rest of the case struggles to recover. Even in learning, the primacy effect creates lasting imprints. The first explanation of a concept you hear becomes your default understanding. Later corrections or refinements have to override that initial version. And overriding is harder than installing. First explanations stick, even when they're incomplete or slightly wrong. The primacy effect doesn't mean later information is irrelevant. It means first information is privileged. It claims the mental real estate. Everything that follows has to earn its space. And earning space is harder than being there first. Recency effect. You sit through a presentation, 30 slides. The first few were strong, the middle dragged, but the last 2 slides were sharp, clear, memorable. When someone asks you later what you thought, you remember those final slides. You say it was good. The middle is already fading. The ending stayed. What comes last has power. Not as much as what came first, but more than what came in between. The most recent information lingers. It's fresh, it's accessible. It shapes the summary your brain creates. Memory favors recency because it's easiest. The brain doesn't have to dig for it. It's still active, still circulating. When you recall a conversation, the last thing said often feels most relevant. Not because it was more important, because it's most available. In arguments, the recency effect shifts outcomes. The person who speaks last often has the advantage. Their point is the one left hanging in the air. The earlier points have faded. The final point becomes the conclusion. It doesn't have to be the strongest, it just has to be the freshest. Advertisements know this. The last message you see before making a purchase decision has outsized influence. That's why retargeting works. You looked at a product days ago. Moved on. Then an ad for it appears right before you're about to buy something else. The recent exposure pulls you back. The earlier interest is reinforced by the recent reminder. Even in performance reviews, recency dominates. A manager is supposed to evaluate the entire year. But the last few months weigh heaviest. The employee who had a strong finish gets rated higher than the one who started strong but finished weak. The full body of work matters less than the most recent impression. Teachers see it when grading essays in a stack. The last few essays read get slightly higher grades than the middle ones, even when quality is similar. The recent ones are fresh in mind. The earlier ones have blurred. Recency becomes a subtle but measurable advantage. The recency effect doesn't erase what came before. It just makes the ending feel like the summary. And summaries are what people remember. Serial position effect. A witness testifies in court. They recall the first detail clearly. The defendant walked in wearing a red jacket. They remember the last detail too. The defendant left through the side door, but the middle. The sequence of events between those 2 points, blurry, fragmented. The witness is confident about the beginning and the end. The middle is where the certainty falls apart. Memory doesn't treat all positions equally. The start gets priority. The finish gets a boost. Everything in between struggles for attention. When you try to remember a sequence, the edges dominate. The center fades. This happens because memory relies on 2 competing biases. The beginning benefits from the primacy effect. It had time to settle into long-term storage. The ending benefits from the recency effect. It's still fresh. The middle gets crushed between them. It didn't get encoded deeply, and it's not recent enough to still be active. You see it in meetings. Someone presents a list of recommendations. A week later, the team remembers the first one and the last one. The ones in the middle, lost. They weren't ignored during the meeting, they just didn't stick. Position determined retention. Even in learning, the serial position effect shapes what survives. A teacher covers 10 concepts in a lesson. Students remember the first few and the final one. The concepts taught in the middle need more reinforcement to stick. Not because they're harder, because their position worked against them. Grocery lists follow the same pattern. You remember the first few items you wrote down. You remember the last thing you added before leaving. The items in the middle. You're standing in the aisle trying to reconstruct them. Position became memory. Lawyers structure arguments around this. They put their strongest points at the beginning and the end. The middle gets the weaker material, not because it's unimportant, because the audience's memory will treat it that way regardless. The serial position effect doesn't care about content. It cares about placement. Memory isn't fair. It privileges the edges and sacrifices the center. Von Restorff Effect. A list of words appears on a screen. Black text, all lowercase, except one, bright red, capitalized. When asked to recall the list later, which word do you remember? The red one. Not because it was more meaningful, because it stood out. Distinctiveness drives memory. When something breaks the pattern, it gets noticed. And what gets noticed gets remembered. Everything that blends in fades. The unusual stays. The brain is wired to detect difference. Sameness becomes background noise. Your attention slides past it. But when something doesn't match, your focus locks on. That attention creates a memory anchor. The distinct item isn't just seen, it's encoded more deeply. In advertising, this is deliberate. A magazine filled with glossy, colorful ads, then one page with plain black text on white, no images, no color. It stops you. You read it. You remember it. Not because the message was better, because the format broke the pattern. Even in conversations, the von Restorff effect shapes what sticks. Someone lists 5 reasons for a decision. 4 are expected, standard justifications. The 5th is unusual, personal, surprising. A week later, you remember the 5th one clearly. The other 4 have blurred together. The distinct reason survived. Teachers use it without realizing. A lesson that's mostly lecture, then suddenly a demonstration. Students remember the demonstration. A week of standard homework, then one creative project. The project is what they talk about months later. The break in routine created the memory. At work, the person who dresses differently gets remembered in meetings. The presentation with an unexpected visual gets referenced later. The email with an unusual subject line gets opened. Distinction cuts through the noise. But the effect has a limit. If everything is distinct, nothing is. When every ad is loud and colorful, they all blend together. The pattern needs consistency for the break to matter. You can't stand out in a room where everyone's trying to stand out. Distinctiveness only works against sameness. What's different gets remembered. What's the same gets forgotten. Placebo effect. A patient with chronic pain receives a new medication. Within days, the pain lessens. They feel better, more mobile, less reliant on other treatments. The medication is working, except it's not medication. It's a sugar pill, inert, no active ingredients, but the patient's pain is genuinely reduced. The belief created the outcome. Expectation shapes experience. When you believe something will help, your body often responds as if it did, not because the treatment was real, because the belief was. The mind doesn't just interpret pain, it modulates it. And belief is a lever. The mechanism runs deeper than wishful thinking. When you expect relief, your brain releases natural painkillers. Endorphins, dopamine. The same chemicals that real medication triggers. The pill didn't do it, your expectation did. The biochemistry followed the belief. Clinical trials account for this. Every new drug is tested against a placebo, because a significant percentage of people will improve on the fake treatment. Not because they're gullible, because their brains responded to the expectation that they were receiving help. The improvement is real, the cause is internal. It's not limited to pain. Placebo surgeries exist. Patients undergo an operation. Incisions are made. Nothing is actually fixed. The patients recover anyway. Their belief in the procedure activated their body's healing response. The ritual mattered more than the intervention. Even performance responds. Athletes given a substance they believe enhances endurance perform better. The substance is inert, but their belief that they have an advantage changes how they push their limits. The expectation unlocked effort they didn't know they could access. The placebo effect isn't about being tricked. It's about how belief influences biology. Your mind and body aren't separate systems. Expectation communicates downward, and the body listens. When you believe relief is coming, your brain starts preparing for it. Sometimes that preparation is enough. But the effect also reveals a limit. Belief can modulate symptoms. It can't cure diseases. It works on subjective experiences like pain, fatigue. It doesn't fix broken bones or kill infections. The placebo effect is powerful, but it's not magic. It's the brain doing what it can with the tools it has. Belief doesn't replace treatment, but it's part of how treatment works. Nocebo effect. A patient reads the side effects list on a medication. Nausea, headaziness, they take the pill. Within hours, they feel nauseous, a headache starts. They're dizzy, the side effects are real. But the medication they took was a placebo. inert. The symptoms didn't come from the pill, they came from the expectation. Negative belief creates negative outcomes. When you expect harm, your body often delivers it. Not because the harm was real, because the expectation was. The mind doesn't just reduce pain, it can create it. And fear is a trigger. The same mechanism that powers the placebo effect operates in reverse. Expectation influences biochemistry. But when the expectation is negative, the response is too. Anxiety increases stress hormones. Stress amplifies pain perception. The anticipation of suffering can become the suffering itself. Clinical trials see this constantly. Patients given a placebo experience the exact side effects they were warned about. Nausea, fatigue, discomfort. The warnings created the symptoms, not through imagination, through a real physiological response to anticipated harm. It shows up in everyday life. You're told a certain food makes people sick. You eat it and feel nauseous. Not because the food was bad, because the suggestion primed your body to react. The expectation of illness triggered the nausea. The mind interpreted the warning as a prediction and made it true. Even in medical settings, the nocebo effect complicates care. A doctor tells a patient a procedure might be painful. The patient tenses. The tension increases pain sensitivity. The procedure hurts more than it would have if the warning hadn't been given. The warning created the outcome it described. Workers in a building are told the ventilation system might be faulty. Some start reporting headaches and fatigue. Tests show the air quality is fine. But the symptoms persist. The belief in contamination activated a stress response. The symptoms are real. The cause is expectation, not exposure. The nocebo effect doesn't require deception. It just requires belief in a negative outcome. And once that belief is in place, the body often cooperates. Fear communicates downward. The brain prepares for the harm it expects. And sometimes that preparation manifests as the harm itself. The power of expectation cuts both ways. Belief in relief can create relief. Belief in harm can create harm. Self-fulfilling prophecy. A manager believes a new hire won't last. Too inexperienced, too uncertain. So she doesn't invest much time in training. Doesn't include them in key meetings. Gives them low-stakes tasks. The new hire, sensing the lack of confidence, starts doubting themselves. They disengage. Performance drops. Within months, they're gone. The manager's prediction came true. Not because it was accurate, because she made it true. Predictions shape reality. When you expect a certain outcome, you behave in ways that make it more likely. You're not passively observing the future. You're actively creating it. The belief doesn't just predict, it influences. The mechanism is circular. Expectation changes behavior. Behavior changes circumstances. Circumstances confirm the expectation. The loop closes. The prophecy fulfills itself. In schools, it's devastating. A teacher labels a student as a poor learner. She calls on them less, offers less encouragement, groups them with other struggling students. The student internalizes the label, stops trying as hard. Grades drop. The label becomes reality. The teacher's expectation didn't reveal a truth. It created one. Even in relationships, the effect operates quietly. You believe a friendship is fading, so you reach out less, respond slower, cancel plans. The friend notices. They pull back too. The friendship fades, not because it was doomed, because your belief in its decline became the reason for its decline. At work, if you expect a project to fail, you unconsciously undermine it. You prepare less, commit fewer resources, communicate doubt. The team picks up on it. Morale drops, effort decreases, the project fails. The expectation didn't predict the failure. It caused it. The prophecy doesn't require intent. You don't have to deliberately sabotage the outcome. The expectation alone is enough. It shifts priorities, attention, effort. And those shifts accumulate into the result you anticipated. But the loop works both ways. Positive expectations can create positive outcomes. If you believe someone will succeed, you invest more, support more, expect more, and they often rise to meet it. The belief in success becomes part of the path to success. Self-fulfilling prophecies don't tell the future, they make it. Behavioral confirmation. You meet someone you've been told is unfriendly, cold, standoffish, so you approach them cautiously. Keep your distance. Your tone is polite but guarded. They pick up on it. They respond the same way. Brief answers. No warmth. You walk away thinking, yep, unfriendly. Just like I heard. But you didn't discover their personality. You created the interaction that confirmed what you already believed. Expectations don't just shape how you see people. They shape how people act around you. When you expect someone to behave a certain way, you treat them accordingly. And your treatment elicits the behavior you expected. The confirmation isn't evidence, it's a result. The process is subtle. You're not consciously testing the person, but your expectations leak into your behavior, tone, body language, eye contact, the questions you ask, the space you give. All of it communicates what you expect, and people, often unconsciously, adjust to match. In hiring, it warps decisions. An interviewer believes a candidate lacks confidence, so they ask tougher questions, offer less encouragement. Their tone becomes skeptical. The candidate picks up on it. They become more hesitant, second-guess their answers. The interviewer sees and thinks, I was right. They're not confident. But the hesitation was a response to the treatment, not proof of a trait. Even in friendships, the effect shapes dynamics. You assume someone doesn't want to talk, so you don't engage deeply. They sense the distance and mirror it. You interpret their reserve as confirmation. But the reserve was a reaction to your withdrawal. The expectation created the behavior it claimed to observe. Teachers experience this constantly. A student has a reputation for being disruptive. The teacher expects trouble, so they monitor the student more closely, correct them faster. Their interactions are laced with anticipation of misbehavior. The student feels targeted. They act out. The teacher's expectation is confirmed, but the behavior was partly a response to being treated like a problem before anything happened. Behavioral confirmation isn't about lying to yourself. It's about how expectations become invitations. When you expect someone to be distant, you create distance. When you expect hostility, you signal defensiveness, and people respond to the signals. The behavior you see isn't independent of your expectation. It's entangled with it. You think you're observing who someone is, but you're partly creating who they become in that moment. Confirmation bias. You believe a colleague is unreliable. Every time they're late, you notice. Every missed deadline, you remember. But when they're on time, when they deliver early, you barely register it. It doesn't fit the story you've already built. So your brain filters it out. The evidence that contradicts your belief doesn't get the same attention as the evidence that supports it. You're not seeking truth. You're seeking confirmation, and your mind is built to give it to you. Once you form a belief, your brain starts looking for proof. Not proof that you're right or wrong, just proof that you're right. Information that supports your view gets highlighted. Information that challenges it gets dismissed, downplayed, or forgotten. You don't realize you're doing it. The filtering happens automatically. Confirmation bias doesn't just protect your beliefs. It strengthens them. Every piece of supporting evidence makes you more certain. Every contradiction you ignore makes the belief feel more solid. You're not learning. You're reinforcing. It shows up everywhere. You think a restaurant is overrated. You go once and the service is slow. You think, I see. I was right. You ignore the fact that your friends had a great experience there last week. Their experience doesn't count, yours does. The buyer's locked in before you walked through the door. In news consumption, it's relentless. You read sources that align with your views. Those sources confirm what you already think. You avoid sources that challenge you. If you do encounter opposing views, you read them skeptically. You look for flaws. When you read something that agrees with you, you accept it without question. The information hasn't changed. Your filter has. Even in relationships, the bias quietly erodes trust. You decide someone isn't listening to you. Every conversation where they seem distracted confirms it. The conversations where they were fully present. You forget them. The belief becomes self-sustaining. The evidence you notice is the evidence that fits. Managers fall into it when evaluating employees. An employee is labeled a poor performer. The manager notices every mistake, ignores every success. The employee could improve dramatically, but the label sticks because the manager's attention is biased toward confirming it. Confirmation bias doesn't make you dishonest. It makes you selective. And selectivity over time distorts reality. You're not seeing the full picture. You're seeing the picture your belief wants you to see. Negativity bias. Bad is stronger than good. A criticism stings more than a compliment soothes. A single negative review outweighs 10 positive ones. One harsh comment in a meeting echoes longer than a dozen affirmations. The negative doesn't just get noticed, it dominates. You remember insults for years. Compliments fade by the next day. It's not because you're pessimistic. It's because your brain prioritizes threats over rewards, and negativity registers as a threat. The mechanism is evolutionary. Your ancestors survived by paying attention to danger. A rustling bush could be a predator. Missing that signal meant death. Missing a positive opportunity meant a smaller meal. The cost of ignoring the negative was higher, so the brain evolved to weight it more heavily. That bias carries into modern life. A performance review lists 9 strengths and 1 area for improvement. You fixate on the 1. The 9 don't register as deeply. The negative punches through. The positive gets absorbed and forgotten. In relationships, negativity tilts the balance. A partner says something thoughtless. It overshadows a week of kindness. One argument can outweigh months of stability. The negative moment doesn't just hurt. It becomes the narrative. You have to work harder to remember the good because your brain isn't wired to hold on to it with the same grip. At work, one mistake can undo a streak of solid performance. A project succeeds, barely mentioned. A project fails, talked about for months. The failure creates more memory, more emotion, more weight. Success fades into the baseline. Failure sticks. Even in decision-making, negativity dominates. The possibility of loss feels more significant than the possibility of gain. You're more motivated to avoid losing what you have than to gain something new. The pain of loss is sharper than the pleasure of gain. The brain treats them unequally. Social media amplifies it. Negative comments get more engagement than positive ones. Outrage spreads faster than appreciation. The algorithms recognize this and feed it. The negativity loop tightens. Negativity bias doesn't make you wrong. It makes you imbalanced. You're not seeing reality clearly. You're seeing it through a filter that magnifies the bad and minimizes the good. And over time, that filter shapes how you perceive everything. Optimism bias. Why do most people think they're above average drivers? Why do couples getting married dismiss divorce statistics? Why do smokers believe lung cancer happens to other people, not them? Because the brain has a built-in tilt toward optimism. You don't think bad things will happen to you at the same rate they happen to others. You know the risks exist. You just don't believe they apply to you personally. The statistics are real. But somehow you're the exception. It's called optimism bias, not because you're delusional, but because your brain protects you from fully internalizing risk. If you truly believed the worst outcomes were as likely for you as they are for everyone else, you'd be paralyzed. So your mind quietly adjusts the odds in your favor. It's not accurate, but it keeps you moving. The bias shows up in planning. You think a project will take 2 weeks, it takes 4. You underestimate how long tasks take because you imagine the ideal scenario. No delays, no obstacles, things going smoothly. You're not lying to yourself. You're just not accounting for friction, and your brain doesn't push you to. In health, the bias is everywhere. People know smoking causes cancer. They keep smoking. They know obesity increases health risks. They delay changes. The risk feels abstract, distant, something that happens to someone else. Your brain lets you believe you'll be fine, even when the data says otherwise. Entrepreneurs rely on it. Most new businesses fail. Every entrepreneur knows this. They start anyway. They believe they'll be the exception, and sometimes that belief is necessary. Without it, no one would take the risk. But the bias doesn't change the odds. It just makes the odds feel irrelevant. Even in relationships, people overestimate their chances of lasting success. Divorce rates are well known. Couples still believe it won't happen to them. That belief isn't based on unique circumstances. It's based on the brain's tendency to see the future as brighter than probability suggests. Optimism bias isn't inherently bad. It drives action. It makes risk-taking possible. But it also leads to poor preparation, underestimating timelines, ignoring warnings, skipping precautions. You think you'll be fine. And sometimes you are, but not as often as your brain convinces you. The bias doesn't protect you from bad outcomes. It just makes you less likely to see them coming. Availability heuristic. A plane crashes. The news covers it for days. Suddenly, people are afraid to fly. They drive instead. But driving is statistically far more dangerous. More people die in car accidents every year than in plane crashes. The data is clear, yet the fear of flying spikes. Why? Because the plane crash is vivid, recent, easy to recall, and your brain mistakes ease of recall for frequency. When something is easy to remember, it feels more common than it is. The availability heuristic makes you judge likelihood based on how easily examples come to mind, not on actual data, on mental accessibility. Plane crashes are dramatic, they make headlines, they stick in memory. Car accidents are routine. Most don't get reported beyond local news. They blend into the background. So even though car accidents are far more frequent, plane crashes feel more dangerous. Your brain isn't lying. It's just using the wrong measure. The heuristic shapes fear in distorted ways. After a shark attack gets heavy media coverage, beach attendance drops. But shark attacks are incredibly rare. You're more likely to be struck by lightning. Yet the availability of the shark attack story makes the risk feel imminent. The vividness replaces the reality. At work, recent events dominate decision-making. A project failed last month. Everyone's cautious about similar projects now. A project that failed 2 years ago, barely considered. Recency makes the recent failure feel more representative of risk than it actually is. The pattern gets overgeneralized because the example is fresh. In hiring, if the last few hires didn't work out, managers become overly cautious. They tighten criteria. They second-guess candidates. The recent failures loom larger than the years of successful hirers that came before. The availability of the negative examples distorts the overall track record. Even personal decisions follow the heuristic. You hear about a friend getting sick from food at a restaurant. You avoid that restaurant for months, but you've eaten there a dozen times without issue. The one negative story is vivid. The dozen uneventful meals aren't. The heuristic makes the exception feel like the rule. The availability heuristic isn't about being irrational. It's about using the information your brain can access most easily. But ease of access doesn't correlate with accuracy. What's memorable isn't always what's common. And what feels likely isn't always what's probable. Your perception of risk is shaped by what you can recall, not by what's real. Representativeness heuristic. You meet someone at a conference. They're wearing glasses, reading a book during breaks, and speaking carefully. You assume they're a librarian, maybe an academic, definitely not a salesperson. But you're guessing based on stereotypes. You have no actual information about their job. You're judging based on how well they match your mental image of certain professions. When something resembles your mental prototype, you assume it belongs to that category, even when the odds say otherwise. That's the representativeness heuristic. You judge likelihood by resemblance, not probability. The problem is that resemblance is a terrible measure of likelihood. There are far more salespeople than librarians. Even if this person fits the librarian stereotype, they're statistically more likely to be in a more common profession. But your brain doesn't calculate base rates. It matches patterns. Investors fall into this constantly. A startup has a charismatic founder, sleek branding, and a compelling pitch. It resembles past success stories. So investors assume it will succeed. They're not evaluating the business fundamentals. They're matching it to a mental image of what successful startups look like. Most startups fail. But the resemblance overrides the statistics. In medicine, doctors sometimes diagnose based on how well symptoms match a textbook case. A patient presents with certain signs. The doctor thinks of a rare disease because the symptoms fit the profile perfectly. But common diseases are far more likely. The representativeness of the rare disease makes it feel more probable than it is. The heuristic can lead to misdiagnosis. Juries use it when evaluating defendants. Someone looks the part, acts the part, fits the mental image of guilty or innocent. The judgment shifts based on resemblance to a stereotype, not evidence. A well-dressed, articulate defendant gets more benefit of the doubt than someone who fits a criminal stereotype. The heuristic overrides the facts. Even in everyday judgments, the heuristic distorts conclusions. You see a sequence of coin flips heads, heads, tails, 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 feels random. You see heads, 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 feels rigged. But both sequences are equally probable. The second one doesn't resemble your mental image of randomness, so you assume it's not. The pattern matching overrules the math. The representativeness heuristic makes you confident in judgments that aren't based on evidence. You're relying on similarity, and similarity is seductive, but it's not reliability. Fundamental attribution error. Someone cuts you off in traffic. Your immediate thought, what an aggressive driver. Reckless. Selfish. You don't think, maybe they're rushing to the hospital. You assume the behavior reflects who they are, not the situation they're in. But when you cut someone off, you have a reason. You were distracted. The exit came up faster than you expected. You're not a bad driver. You just made a mistake. The situation explains it. Different standards. Their behavior reveals character. Your behavior reveals circumstances. That's the fundamental attribution error. When judging others, you overestimate personality and underestimate situation. When judging yourself, you do the opposite. The error is pervasive. A coworker snaps at you in a meeting. You think they're irritable, difficult to work with. You don't consider that they might have gotten terrible news that morning, or that they're under pressure from their own manager. You see the behavior and assume it's their nature. The context gets ignored. But when you snap at someone, you know exactly why. You were stressed. You didn't sleep well. The deadline was unrealistic. You don't see it as a character flaw. You see it as a reaction to pressure. The situation explains it. The asymmetry creates unfair judgments. A student fails a test. Teachers assume the student didn't study, didn't care. But if a teacher performs poorly in a workshop, they blame the material, the timing, the audience. When others fail, it's internal. When you fail, it's external. In hiring, it's damaging. A candidate stumbles in an interview. The interviewer assumes they're unprepared, not sharp, but the candidate might be dealing with interview anxiety, or they might have had a terrible commute. The interviewer doesn't know, but the error pushes them to attribute the performance to the person's character, not the situation. Even in relationships, the error quietly erodes empathy. Your partner forgets an important date. You think they're careless, inconsiderate. You forget they've been overwhelmed at work. When you forget, you have an excuse. When they forget, it's who they are. The fundamental attribution error doesn't make you cruel. It makes you blind. You're not seeing the full picture. You're seeing behavior without context. And in that gap, you fill in personality where situation belongs. You explain yourself with circumstances. You explain others with character. The error is fundamental because it's automatic, and it's wrong. Actor-observer bias. You're late to a meeting. Traffic was terrible. An accident blocked 2 lanes. You text an apology. When you arrive, you explain the situation. It was beyond your control. Everyone nods. They understand. Circumstances happen. A colleague arrives late to the same meeting the next week. Your first thought isn't about traffic, it's about them. They're disorganized, poor at time management, always running behind. You don't ask about their morning. You've already decided. Same behavior, different explanation. When it's you, the situation is the reason. When it's someone else, their character is the reason. The actor-observer bias splits judgment down the middle. You're the actor in your own life. You see the full context, the pressures, the constraints, the factors outside your control. When you explain your behavior, you point to circumstances. But when you observe others, you don't have that context. You see the action and assume it reflects who they are. At work, it shows up constantly. You miss a deadline because the requirements kept changing. When a coworker misses a deadline, you think they didn't plan well. You give yourself the benefit of context. You don't extend the same courtesy to them. In relationships, it erodes empathy. You cancel plans because you're exhausted, reasonable. But when your friend cancels, you wonder if they're flaky. You explain yourself with circumstances. You explain them with character. The asymmetry builds resentment. Even in arguments, the bias distorts perception. You raise your voice because the other person wasn't listening. They raised their voice because they're aggressive. You had a reason. They have a flaw. The difference isn't in the behavior. It's in whose behavior it is. The bias doesn't require malice. It's a gap in perspective. You live inside your own decisions. You see the reasons behind them, but you observe others from the outside. You see results, not reasons. And in that gap, you fill in personality where situation might belong. You judge yourself by your intentions. You judge others by their actions. Self-serving bias. A project succeeds. You think about your contributions, the late nights, the strategy you pushed for, the problems you solved. You played a key role, maybe the key role. When someone mentions the team effort, you nod. But internally, you're weighing your impact, and it feels significant. The same project fails. Now you're thinking about factors outside your control. The budget was too tight. The timeline was unrealistic. Leadership kept changing direction. You did what you could. The failure wasn't on you. Success is internal. Failure is external. When things go well, you take credit. When things go wrong, you deflect blame. That's the self-serving bias. You interpret outcomes in ways that protect your self-image. The bias isn't conscious dishonesty. It's automatic reframing. Your brain needs to preserve your sense of competence. If every failure was personal, your confidence would collapse. So the mind shifts responsibility. Success confirms your ability. Failure confirms bad luck. Students see it after exams. A high grade, they studied well. A low grade, the test was unfair. The questions were tricky. The material wasn't covered properly. The success validates their intelligence. The failure gets attributed to circumstances. Athletes experience it constantly. A win is skill, preparation, execution. A loss is bad officiating, injuries. The opponent got lucky. The self-image as a strong competitor stays intact because blame gets redirected. Even in relationships, the bias protects ego. A fight ends badly. You think about what the other person said that was out of line, what they misunderstood. When the relationship is going well, you think about how much effort you put in, how thoughtful you've been. The good is yours, the bad is theirs. Managers fall into it when reviewing team performance. Success gets attributed to leadership decisions. Failures get attributed to execution problems or market conditions. The bias lets them maintain confidence while deflecting accountability. The self-serving bias doesn't make you arrogant. It makes you selective. You're protecting your self-concept. But in doing so, you're distorting reality. You're not learning from failure because you're not owning it. And you're not seeing success clearly because you're overestimating your role. The bias keeps your ego safe, but it keeps you from seeing yourself accurately. Hindsight bias. After a stock crashes, everyone saw it coming. The warning signs were obvious. The valuation was insane. Of course it was going to collapse. Except when it was climbing, most of those same people were buying. They didn't see it then. But now looking back, it feels inevitable, predictable, clear. Hindsight rewrites memory. Once you know the outcome, you convince yourself you knew it all along. The past becomes obvious. The uncertainty you actually felt at the time gets erased. You remember clarity that never existed. The bias operates through memory reconstruction. Your brain doesn't store the past like a recording. It rebuilds it. And when it rebuilds, it uses the outcome as a guide. The result becomes the narrative. Everything that happened before gets reinterpreted to fit. The path to the outcome feels like it was always leading there. After a relationship ends, you think, I knew it wouldn't work. You point to early red flags. But at the time, those flags didn't feel definitive. You hoped. You tried. The doubt you feel now wasn't as strong then. Hindsight amplified it. In business, failed strategies look foolish in retrospect. We should have seen it wouldn't work. But at the time, it seemed viable. Reasonable. The failure made it look dumb. The outcome rewrote the evaluation. Doctors experience it when reviewing cases. A patient had a rare condition that got missed initially. Looking back, the symptoms seem obvious. But at the time, the common diagnosis made sense. The correct answer was buried in ambiguity. Hindsight makes it look like negligence. But the uncertainty was real. Even in daily decisions, the bias distorts reflection. You took a route and hit traffic. You think, I should have known that road would be backed up. But you didn't know. You made a reasonable guess. The bad outcome made it feel like a bad decision. It wasn't. It was an uncertain decision that didn't work out. Hindsight bias doesn't just make the past feel predictable. It makes you overconfident about the future. If you believe you always saw things coming, you trust your predictions more than you should. The bias inflates your sense of foresight, and that inflation leads to poor decisions next time. The past wasn't as clear as you remember, and the future won't be as clear as you think. Survivorship bias. Why do successful people always talk about taking risks? Why do they say failure is essential? Because they took risks and succeeded. But what about the people who took the same risks and failed? You don't hear from them. They're not on stage. They're not writing books. They're not giving interviews. The advice you're hearing is filtered. You're only seeing the survivors. Survivorship bias makes you focus on winners and ignore the rest. You study successful companies and try to replicate their strategies. But you're not studying the companies that used the same strategies and went bankrupt. The data is incomplete. The lessons are skewed. The bias emerges from visibility. Success is loud, it gets attention. Failure is quiet, it disappears. So when you look for patterns, you only see the outcomes that made it through. You're not analyzing the full set. You're analyzing the survivors. And survivors always look like they did something right. Entrepreneurs read stories about founders who dropped out of college and built empires. They think, I should drop out too. But they're not hearing about the thousands who dropped out and struggled. The successful dropouts are visible. The unsuccessful ones aren't. The advice is biased by who's left to give it. Investors look at startup unicorns and identify common traits. Visionary founders, aggressive growth, high risk. They invest in companies with those traits. Most fail. But the ones that succeed become the new examples. The cycle continues. The bias keeps pointing to the same patterns because it only counts the wins. Even in self-help, the bias distorts advice. People who succeeded through persistence tell you to never give up, but persistence also leads to wasted years on projects that will never work. The people who gave up and pivoted successfully, they're telling you to quit early. Both are right for their outcomes, but you're only hearing from people whose approach worked. The ones whose approach didn't work aren't writing books. In evaluating risk, survivorship bias makes danger look safer than it is. You see people who took big risks and won. You don't see the ones who took the same risks and lost everything. The visible outcomes make risk look more favorable than it is. The bias doesn't reveal secrets to success. It hides the role of luck. The survivors had skill, but they also had timing, circumstances, and chance. The failures had skill too, but the bias erases them from the data, and without them, the lessons are incomplete. You're learning from the winners, but the losers had the same strategies. Ingroup Bias. A colleague from your department makes a mistake. You think, anyone could have made that error. The instructions were unclear. A colleague from another department makes the same mistake. You think, these should have been more careful. Typical of that team. Same error, different judgment. The difference is group membership. People in your group get the benefit of the doubt. People outside it don't. Ingroup bias makes you favor those you identify with. Not because they're better, because they're yours, your team, your department, your school, your country. The affiliation creates a filter. Positive traits get amplified for the in-group. Negative traits get downplayed. For outgroups, it's reversed. The bias is tribal. Evolutionary. Your ancestors survived by trusting their group and being cautious of outsiders. The in-group was safety. The out-group was potential threat. That wiring persists. You automatically extend generosity to people you see as part of your circle. You withhold it from people outside. At work, it shapes hiring. A candidate went to the same university as the interviewer. The interviewer feels a connection, interprets ambiguous answers more favorably, overlooks weaknesses. A candidate from a different background doesn't get the same generosity. The bias isn't overt. It's in the small interpretations that tip judgment. In sports, fans see the same foul differently depending on which team committed it. Their team. The ref made a bad call. The other team, obvious foul, deserved penalty. The action is identical. The group membership changes the verdict. Even in neighborhoods, the bias creates division. Someone from your area is having a loud party. It's annoying, but you assume they don't realize how loud it is. Someone from the next block over does the same. They're inconsiderate, disrespectful. The in-group gets excuses. The out-group gets blame. Politically, in-group bias fuels polarization. Your side makes a questionable decision. You find reasons it makes sense. The other side makes the same decision. It's evidence of their corruption or incompetence. The policy didn't change. the group did, and the group determines the interpretation. The bias doesn't require animosity toward the outgroup. It just requires preference for the in-group. You're not attacking others. You're protecting your own, but the result is the same. Unequal treatment based on arbitrary lines that feel meaningful because they define who you are. In-group bias doesn't make you loyal, it makes you partial, and partiality unchecked becomes unfairness. Authority bias. A doctor recommends a treatment. You don't question it, they're the expert. They went to medical school. They have the credentials. You assume they're right. But what if the treatment is outdated? What if newer research suggests something better? You don't check. The authority said it, so you trust it. Authority bias makes you defer to expertise without scrutiny. When someone has credentials, a title, or a position of power, you assume their judgment is sound. You stop questioning. The authority becomes the answer. The bias exists because expertise is real. Specialists know things you don't. Deferring to them makes sense most of the time. But the bias doesn't distinguish between valid authority and assumed authority. It doesn't check whether the person actually knows what they're talking about. It just sees the status and trusts it. The famous Milgram experiment demonstrated this. Participants were told by an authority figure to administer electric shocks to another person. The shocks weren't real, but the participants didn't know that. Most continued increasing the voltage because the authority told them to. The instructions came from someone in a lab coat. That was enough. The bias overrode their discomfort. At work, authority bias stifles disagreement. A senior leader proposes a strategy. It has flaws. People see them. But no one speaks up. The leader's position creates a shield. Questioning feels risky. Disagreement feels insubordinate. The bias silences better ideas because they come from lower ranks. In education, students assume the textbook is always right. The teacher is always right. They don't interrogate the information. The source has authority, so the content must be accurate. But textbooks have errors. Teachers have gaps. Authority doesn't guarantee correctness. Even in marketing, the bias is exploited. A celebrity endorses a product. They have no expertise in the field, but their fame creates a sense of authority. People trust the recommendation, not because it's informed, because it came from someone recognizable. Experts can be wrong. Authorities can be biased. Credentials don't eliminate blind spots. But authority bias makes you treat authority as infallible. You stop asking questions, you stop verifying. The position does the thinking for you. The bias doesn't make you respectful, it makes you passive. And passivity in the face of authority can lead to bad decisions, missed opportunities, and unchecked mistakes. Trust expertise, but don't stop thinking. Loss aversion. You find $20 on the street. Nice, a small lift. But it fades quickly. Later that day, you realize you lost $20 from your wallet. The feeling isn't small, it gnaws at you. You replay when it might have happened, where you might have dropped it. The loss occupies more mental space than the gain, even though the amounts are identical. Losing hurts more than winning feels good. The pain of losing something outweighs the pleasure of gaining the same thing. Not by a little, by a lot. Your brain treats losses as more significant than equivalent gains. Loss aversion shapes decisions in ways you don't notice. When choosing between options, you're not weighing them equally. You're trying to avoid loss first. Gain is secondary. The fear of losing overpowers the appeal of winning. Investors see it constantly. A stock drops. They hold on, hoping it recovers. They don't want to lock in the loss. Even when selling and moving to a better investment makes sense, they hold. The aversion to realizing the loss keeps them stuck. Meanwhile, when a stock gains, they sell quickly. Lock in the win. The asymmetry is clear. Losses hurt so much they're worth holding. Gains feel fragile, so they're worth taking early. In negotiations, loss aversion gives leverage. Frame an offer as avoiding a loss rather than gaining a benefit. "You'll lose this price if you wait," is more compelling than "you'll save money if you act now." Same outcome, different emotional weight. The loss framing hits harder. Even in relationships, people stay in situations that aren't working because leaving feels like losing. Losing time already invested. Losing the identity of being in a relationship. Losing the future they imagined. The pain of those losses keeps them in place, even when staying has costs too. Retailers exploit it. Free trials work because cancelling feels like a loss. You had access. Now you'd lose it. The aversion to loss makes you more likely to convert to a paid plan. You're not just gaining continued service. You're avoiding losing what you already have. Loss aversion doesn't make you cautious. It makes you asymmetric. You'll take bigger risks to avoid a loss than to achieve a gain. The fear of losing warps the math, and the warp pushes decisions toward protecting what you have, even when letting go would serve you better. Endowment Effect. You're selling a used laptop. You think it's worth $500. It's in good condition. You've taken care of it. A buyer offers $300. You're offended. It's worth more than that. But when you look at the same model online, similar ones are listed for $300. Yours isn't special, but it feels special because it's yours. Ownership inflates value. Once you own something, you value it more than you would if you didn't. Not because it changed, because your relationship to it changed. Possession creates attachment, and attachment increases perceived worth. The endowment effect makes you overvalue what you have. Someone who doesn't own the item sees its market value. You see its personal value. The object didn't get better when you bought it. Your valuation did. The mechanism is tied to loss aversion. Selling something feels like losing it, and losing hurts. So you demand more to part with it than you'd pay to acquire it. The gap isn't rational, it's emotional. Ownership shifted the reference point. Now, keeping it is the baseline. Selling is a loss. The effect shows up in housing. Homeowners price their houses based on what they think the house is worth to them. The memories, the improvements, the time invested. Buyers see market comparables. The gap between the seller's price and the buyer's offer often comes down to the endowment effect. The seller isn't being greedy. They genuinely believe the house is worth more because it's theirs. Even with small items, the effect operates. You're given a mug, free. A few minutes later, someone offers to buy it. You ask for more than you'd pay for the same mug in a store. The mug became yours. Ownership created value that wasn't there before. Negotiators encounter it constantly. People won't let go of a position because they've already claimed it. Letting go feels like losing ground. Even when the position isn't worth defending, the fact that it's theirs makes it valuable. The ownership is psychological, but the resistance is real. The endowment effect doesn't make you sentimental. It makes you biased. You're not assessing value objectively. You're assessing it through the lens of ownership. And ownership distorts the number. What's yours feels worth more, not because it is, because you have it. Sunk cost fallacy. Why do you keep watching a bad movie an hour in? Why do companies pour money into failing projects? Why do people stay in relationships that stopped working years ago? Because of what's already been invested, the time, the money, the effort. Walking away now would mean all of that was wasted. So you keep going. Not because the future looks promising, because the past feels too expensive to abandon. That's the sunk cost fallacy. Letting past investment dictate future decisions, even when the investment is gone and can't be recovered. You're throwing good resources after bad, because you can't let go of what you've already spent. The logic fails immediately when you pull it apart. The money is spent. The time is gone. Those costs are sunk. They don't change based on what you do next. But your brain struggles to accept that. It feels like quitting means the investment was for nothing. So you keep investing, hoping to justify the original cost. Businesses see it in product development. A project is clearly failing. The market shifted. The technology is outdated. But the company has already spent millions. Walking away feels like admitting those millions were wasted. So they spend more. The sunk cost keeps them locked in. The future losses pile up because they can't release the past. Students experience it with majors. 2 years into a degree they hate, but switching feels like those 2 years were wasted. So they finish, graduate, enter a field they never wanted. The sunk cost controlled the trajectory. Not because staying was the right choice, because leaving felt too costly. Even in personal habits, the fallacy operates. You bought an expensive gym membership. You're not using it, but you keep paying because canceling feels like admitting the initial purchase was a mistake. The money is gone either way. Canceling doesn't lose it, but it feels like it does. The sunk cost fallacy doesn't make you persistent. It makes you trapped. You're not moving forward. You're honoring the past. And the past doesn't care. It's already over. The only question that matters is whether continuing makes sense from here. Not whether it made sense to start. But the fallacy won't let you ask that question. It keeps pulling you backward, forcing you to defend decisions that are already done. Status quo bias. Your phone plan has been the same for years. You know there are better options. Cheaper plans more developed. But switching feels like work. Comparing plans, calling customer service, transferring everything. So you don't. You keep paying more for less because staying put is easier than changing. The status quo bias makes inertia feel like a decision. When faced with change, you default to whatever's already happening. Not because it's better, because it's current. The existing state has a built-in advantage. Change requires effort, staying requires nothing. The bias operates through several layers. Change introduces uncertainty. The current situation is known. You understand it. Even if it's not ideal, it's predictable. A new option might be better, but it might not be. The risk of change feels larger than the cost of staying, so you stay. There's also the effort barrier. Change demands action, research, decisions, implementation. Staying demands nothing. Your brain calculates the energy required and defaults to the path of least resistance. The status quo wins by default. In finance, it shows up everywhere. People stay with the same bank for decades, even when better rates are available elsewhere. Switching feels complicated. Moving accounts, updating automatic payments, rememorizing login credentials. The current bank isn't great, but it's familiar. The bias keeps them locked in. Employers see it in benefits enrollment. Most employees stick with the default options. Not because the defaults are optimal, because changing requires reviewing all the alternatives, making decisions. The effort feels high, so they leave everything as is, year after year. Even in health, the bias resists change. A medication isn't working well. The doctor suggests switching to something newer, more effective, but the patient hesitates. The current medication is tolerable. Switching means adjusting to something new, monitoring for side effects. The known feels safer than the unknown. The bias favors the familiar. The status quo bias doesn't make you satisfied. It makes you stuck. You're not choosing to stay because staying is good. You're staying because changing feels hard. And in that gap between effort and inertia, opportunities get lost. Better options go untaken. The current state persists not by merit, but by default. Choice overload. Too many options don't make decisions easier, they make them impossible. A store offers 3 types of jam. Customers sample, decide, buy. The same store offers 24 types. Customers sample more, but fewer buy. The abundance didn't help. It paralyzed. When options multiply, decisions freeze. Choice overload turns selection into a burden. A few options feel manageable. You can compare them, weigh the trade-offs, make a choice. But when options reach a certain threshold, comparison becomes overwhelming. You can't evaluate everything, so you evaluate nothing, and you walk away. The mechanism is cognitive strain. Every additional option requires more mental processing. Is this one better than that one? How does it compare to the third, the fifth, the 10th? The effort compounds. At some point, the brain gives up. The decision feels too complex. Easier to avoid it than to solve it. In consumer settings, it's everywhere. Streaming services offer thousands of movies. You scroll for 20 minutes, find nothing, give up. Not because there's nothing good, because the volume of choice made choosing feel impossible. A smaller library would have been easier. Restaurants with massive menus see the same effect. Customers take longer to order, feel less satisfied with what they choose, wonder if something else would have been better. A focused menu makes decisions faster and leaves people happier. The constraint helps. Even in careers, choice overload stalls progress. Someone explores options, researches dozens of paths, each one seems viable. But comparing them all feels paralyzing, so they stay in their current job. Not because it's the best option, because choosing among too many alternatives felt harder than choosing nothing. Dating apps amplify the effect. Endless profiles create the illusion of infinite choice. But the abundance makes commitment harder. There's always another option to consider, another profile to swipe. The overload prevents decisions from settling. People keep searching because the volume of choice suggests something better is always just ahead. Choice overload doesn't expand freedom. It contracts it. You're not empowered by options. You're trapped by them. And in that trap, you either make decisions poorly or you don't make them at all. The paralysis becomes the outcome. The abundance becomes the obstacle. Diffusion of responsibility. A person collapses on a crowded street. Dozens of people see it. No one stops. Not because they don't care. Because everyone assumes someone else will help. The responsibility doesn't multiply with the crowd, it divides. Each person feels a smaller share. And when everyone feels less responsible, no one acts. Diffusion of responsibility scatters accountability across a group until it disappears. When you're alone, the responsibility is clear. It's on you. But in a group, the responsibility gets distributed. You assume others will step in. And while you're assuming, they're assuming too. The result is inaction. The mechanism is psychological dilution. The larger the group, the smaller your individual share of responsibility feels. You're not the only one who could act, so acting doesn't feel urgent. Someone else is probably better equipped, better positioned, more qualified. You wait for them. They're waiting for someone else. The loop continues. No one moves. In emergencies, the effect is devastating. The more bystanders present, the less likely any individual will help. It's not apathy, it's diffusion. The presence of others creates a buffer. It lets you rationalize an action. Someone else will handle it. But when everyone thinks that, no one handles it. At work, diffusion of responsibility kills accountability. A team is assigned a task. No individual owns it. Everyone assumes someone else is tracking progress. Deadlines slip. The project stalls. Not because people are incompetent. Because responsibility wasn't assigned to anyone specifically. It was assigned to everyone. And everyone is no one. Even in meetings, diffusion operates. A problem is raised. The group discusses it. But no one is designated to solve it. The conversation ends. The problem persists. Everyone thought someone else would take it on. No one did. Online, the effect amplifies. Thousands see harmful content. Almost no one reports it. Each person assumes others already have. The crowd creates a shield. You're just one person among many. Your individual action feels unnecessary. But when everyone feels that way, the content stays up. The harm continues. Diffusion of responsibility doesn't make people selfish. It makes them passive. You're not refusing to act. You're waiting for someone else to act first. But everyone is waiting, and in that collective pause, responsibility evaporates. The crowd doesn't strengthen action, it weakens it. The more people present, the less anyone feels the need to move. Deindividuation. A concert crowd surges forward. People push, shove. Behavior they'd never display alone, but in the mass of bodies, individual identity dissolves. No one's watching you specifically. You're just part of the crowd. The normal rules feel suspended. Restraint loosens. Actions that would feel wrong in isolation feel permissible in the group. When individual identity fades, behavior shifts. You stop acting like yourself and start acting like the crowd. Anonymity removes accountability. And without accountability, inhibitions drop. Deindividuation happens when you lose your sense of individual self-awareness in a group. The larger and more anonymous the group, the stronger the effect. You're not being observed as an individual. You're absorbed into the collective. And in that absorption, personal responsibility dilutes. The mechanism is rooted in self-monitoring. When you're alone or in a small group, you're aware of yourself. You monitor your behavior. You consider how you'll be perceived. But in a large, anonymous crowd, that self-awareness fades. You're not thinking about your individual actions. You're swept along with the group's momentum. Online, Deindividuation amplifies. Anonymous usernames, no face-to-face contact. People say things they'd never say in person. Cruel comments, extreme opinions. The anonymity removes the social filters. The behavior isn't who they are in daily life. It's who they become when individual identity is hidden. Sports fans experience it. In the stadium, surrounded by thousands wearing the same colors, individual restraint weakens. They yell things they'd never shout on a quiet street. The crowd absorbs the individual. The identity shifts from pen to us, and kos operates under different rules. Even in riots, Deindividuation explains escalation. People loot, vandalize, commit acts they'd never consider alone. The crowd provides cover. Responsibility scatters. No single person feels accountable because everyone is doing it. The group becomes the actor. The individual disappears. Deindividuation doesn't make people bad. It makes them susceptible. The loss of individual identity removes the brakes. What emerges isn't necessarily who you are. It's who you become when the usual constraints are gone. Social facilitation. Performance improves when you're being watched. Not always, but often. You're at the gym. Alone, you lift a certain weight. Someone walks by. Suddenly, you push harder. You add another rep. You didn't plan it. But the presence of another person shifted your effort. The audience, even an accidental one, changed your performance. Social facilitation makes you perform better on simple or well-practiced tasks when others are watching. The presence of an audience activates you. Your energy increases, your focus sharpens. For tasks you already know how to do, observation boosts performance. The mechanism is arousal. Being watched increases physiological activation. Heart rate rises slightly, attention narrows. For tasks that are automatic or easy, this arousal helps. It pushes you to perform at a higher level. The audience becomes a performance enhancer. Athletes see it constantly. Training alone versus competing in front of a crowd. The crowd elevates performance, not because the athlete learned anything new, because the presence of observers activated a higher level of effort. The same skills, more intensity. Even in everyday tasks, the effect operates. You clean faster when someone's visiting. You work more efficiently when a colleague is nearby. The observation creates subtle pressure. And that pressure for familiar tasks drives better execution. But the effect reverses for difficult or unfamiliar tasks. If you're learning something new, being watched hurts performance. The arousal that helps with easy tasks becomes interference with hard ones. The pressure to perform well while learning creates anxiety. Mistakes increase. The audience that would boost a simple task disrupts a complex one. Students experience this during exams. If the material is well studied, the exam setting can sharpen focus. But if the material is shaky, the pressure of being evaluated makes it harder to think clearly. The same presence that facilitates can also impair. It depends on whether the task is automatic or effortful. Social facilitation doesn't make you better at everything. It makes you better at what you already know how to do. The audience amplifies existing ability. It doesn't create new ability. Social loafing. You're assigned a group project, 5 people. The work gets divided, you do your part, but not your best. You know others are contributing. Your individual effort feels less critical. The group will get it done. Your reduced effort won't be noticed, so you coast. Just a little. When working in a group, individual effort often decreases. Not because people are lazy, because individual contribution feels less visible, less essential. The group diffuses responsibility and effort together. Social loafing happens when people exert less effort in a group than they would working alone. The larger the group, the stronger the effect. Your contribution blends into the collective output. You're not individually accountable, so you pull back without even realizing it. The mechanism is diffusion of responsibility and evaluation. When you work alone, your output is entirely yours. Success or failure is directly tied to your effort. But in a group, your contribution is one piece among many. If the group fails, it's not just your fault. If it succeeds, it's not just your achievement. The connection between effort and outcome weakens. And when that connection weakens, effort drops. Research shows this clearly. Ask people to pull a rope alone. Measure their effort. Ask them to pull as part of a group. Individual effort decreases. They're not deliberately slacking. They're unconsciously reducing output because the group context makes individual effort less salient. At work, social loafing kills productivity in team settings. A task is assigned to a group. No individual ownership. Everyone assumes someone else is carrying more weight. The collective effort is lower than if the same task had been divided with clear individual accountability. The group structure invited the loafing. Even in brainstorming sessions, the effect operates. People contribute less in large groups, not because they have fewer ideas, because speaking up feels less necessary. Others are talking. Your silence won't be noticed. Individual participation drops as group size increases. The fix is simple but often ignored. Make individual contributions visible. Assign specific accountability. When people know their effort will be seen and evaluated individually, social loafing decreases. The group context remains, but individual responsibility is restored. Social loafing doesn't mean people are unmotivated. It means group settings, without clear individual accountability, reduce effort. The problem isn't the people. It's the structure. False consensus effect. You don't like a popular TV show. You assume plenty of other people feel the same way. You're surprised when almost everyone you talk to loves it. You thought your view was more common than it is. You projected your preference onto others and assumed it was widespread. The false consensus effect makes you overestimate how many people share your opinions, beliefs, and behaviors. You think your views are more common than they are. You assume others see the world the way you do. And when they don't, it's surprising. The bias works because your perspective is the only one you experience directly. You live inside your own thoughts. Your views feel reasonable to you. So you assume they're reasonable to others too. You project your internal experience outward and mistake it for consensus. Someone who recycles assumes most people recycle. Someone who doesn't assumes most people don't. Both are overestimating agreement with their own behavior. The bias doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from using yourself as the baseline for normal. In decision-making, the effect creates blind spots. You choose an option that makes sense to you. You assume it makes sense to others. When they choose differently, you're confused. You didn't realize your reasoning wasn't universal. The consensus you assumed didn't exist. Politically, the effect fuels surprise during elections. People surround themselves with others who think similarly. They assume their views are mainstream. Then the results come in. The other side won. But how? Everyone I know voted differently. The bubble reinforced the false consensus. The actual distribution was invisible. Even in small social decisions, the bias operates. You suggest a restaurant. You assume others will like it because you do. They're lukewarm. You're surprised. You thought your preference was more universal than it was. You used your taste as a proxy for group taste. The proxy failed. The false consensus effect doesn't make you self-centered. It makes you miscalibrated. You're using the wrong reference point. You is not we. Your experience is not everyone's experience. But your brain treats it as representative. And that mistake leads to misplaced confidence and predictable surprise. Illusory truth effect. You hear a claim once, you're skeptical. You hear it again a week later, still doubtful. A month later, you hear it a third time. Now it sounds more plausible. You haven't seen evidence. You haven't verified it. But the repetition made it feel more true. Familiarity got mistaken for accuracy. Repetition creates the illusion of truth. The more often you encounter a statement, the more true it feels. Not because you've confirmed it, because you've heard it before. The brain treats familiarity as a signal of validity, and that signal is often wrong. The illusory truth effect operates through processing fluency. The first time you encounter information, your brain has to work to process it. It's new, unfamiliar, requires effort. But the second time, it's easier. The third time, even easier. That ease of processing feels good, and your brain misinterprets that good feeling as truth. The statement isn't more accurate, it's more familiar. But familiarity feels like credibility. Advertisers exploit this ruthlessly. Repeat a slogan enough times, and people start believing it. Not because the claim is supported, because the repetition made it feel true. The mechanism doesn't care about evidence. It responds to exposure. In politics, the effect shapes public perception. A false claim gets repeated across media. Fact-checkers debunk it. But the repetition continues. Even people who know it's false start feeling uncertain. They've heard it so many times. Maybe there's something to it. The repetition overpowers the correction. Even in daily conversation, the effect operates. Someone tells you a fact, you don't remember where you heard it. Later, someone else mentions the same thing. Now it feels confirmed. You've heard it from two sources. Must be true. But the second source might have gotten it from the first. Or both might be wrong. The repetition didn't validate the claim. It just made it familiar. The illusory truth effect doesn't require you to stop thinking critically. It works even when you're trying to evaluate information carefully. Repetition bypasses analysis. It creates a feeling of truth that operates beneath conscious reasoning. And feelings, especially familiar ones, are persuasive. The effect doesn't make truth, it mimics it. And in a world where information repeats across platforms, that mimicry becomes hard to distinguish from the real thing. Curse of knowledge. You know how to solve a puzzle. You try to explain it to someone who doesn't. You skip steps. You assume they see what's obvious to you. They don't, they're lost. You're frustrated. Why don't they get it? But the problem isn't them, it's you. Once you know something, you can't remember what it's like not to know it. The curse of knowledge makes it nearly impossible to communicate clearly once you're an expert. You've internalized the information. It feels simple, obvious. But to someone encountering it for the first time, it's not. And you can't see that gap because you're on the wrong side of it. The curse operates through perspective-taking failure. You're trying to imagine what the other person understands. But your knowledge interferes. You can't unknow what you know. The concepts that feel basic to you aren't basic, they're learned. But you've forgotten the learning process. So you explain from where you are now, not from where they are. Teachers experience this constantly. A concept they've taught for years feels straightforward. They explain it quickly. Students are confused. The teacher doesn't understand why. It's so clear. But it's only clear because the teacher has internalized it. The students are seeing it fresh. The gap between expert familiarity and novice confusion is the curse in action. In the workplace, the curse kills onboarding. An experienced employee trains a new hire. They assume knowledge the new hire doesn't have. They use jargon without defining it. They skip context because it feels obvious. The new hire nods along but doesn't actually understand. The trainer thought they were being clear. But clarity requires meeting the other person where they are. And the curse makes that almost impossible. Even in writing, the curse creates confusion. A technical writer who understands the product deeply writes instructions. They leave out steps. They assume the reader knows things the reader doesn't. The instructions make sense to the writer. They're incomprehensible to the user. The writer can't see the gaps because knowledge filled them in automatically. The curse of knowledge doesn't make you a bad communicator. It makes you blind. You're not withholding information. You're unaware that it's missing. Once something becomes obvious to you, you lose access to the state of not knowing it. And without that access, you can't bridge the gap. The curse is permanent. You can't unlearn. But you can compensate. Slow down. Assume less. Ask what the other person already knows. Test comprehension early. The knowledge won't go away. But awareness of the curse can limit the damage.